So Shari and Jed have been gracious enough to join me today on Grill Country because as happens to me sometimes, I woke up. Actually, it wasn't even quite 2 in the morning. It was more like 1:45, and I don't want to call it a thought because if I say it's a thought, it sounds like it's something I reason my way to, and I don't want to call it a vision because I didn't really see anything.
Mhm.
So I'm going to say it's almost like something I overheard. Maybe I overheard a conversation of the angels that came to me because it very clearly wasn't, it didn't seem to be my own thought to me.
I like
It was something that was definitely coming to me fresh and new. And so the thought was this, and this came to me in a flash. So it's going to sound like it's going to,
like a
when I
thunder.
talk about it, it's going to sound like it was a discursive reasoning process, but this is not how it actually came to me because it came to me, it was all in one complete thing. And so there were two parts to it, at least two parts to it. So part one is that the divine name of God that is expressed in the Tetragrammaton with the Yud He Vav He is actually a reflection of the God world relationship, wherein uh, the Yud, the initial He, and the Vav represent the respective persons of the Trinity, and the repeated He represents Christ or the Logos or the Son, through whom all things were created. So it is proper that the cosmos, all things that exist, bear the image of the Logos to some extent. That's how they exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first part. And then the second part was that just this instinct that there is a connection between the way the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, because there's a couple passages from Revelation that I want to get into today, talk about naming and the way we kind of deal in philosophy and theology with the concept of hypostasis. Like that there's like that is the when the Bible is talking about names, it's expressing something that is conceptually similar to what we try to get at with that theological language.
Mhm.
And I actually think that the biblical language is more accessible and easier for people to understand than the philosophical and technical theological language can be, which can be very, very confusing.
Yeah.
So, for example, I think it's easier for us to intuit how the unity of something can be expressed in its name than it is for us to understand how the unity of something is expressed through its essence or its hypostasis, or whichever one of the terms you want to say is the thing that expresses the unity of it. So those were that was it. And then I kind of like put out a tweet about it, which didn't get much engagement. uh, then I shared my thoughts with Shari, and Shari had, I love one of the things that Shari said to me that I thought was really cool was that she said that she always thought of hypostasis as glue. And to me, that kind of works because it's like hypostasis is a binding agent, right? So it's like it's the hypostasis of Christ that holds his divine and human natures together as a unity. So it is like, so it's a binding agent, it's a glue. So I thought that was a really, I like that she said that it's the glue, it's the glue. And specifically I would say it's the ultimate glue is the hypostasis of Christ. So that's
Well,
the
the
thought.
first thing that comes to my mind, I don't know, maybe you've already considered this, but you said that you had, the first part was this, the tetragrammaton. The second part was the actual function of, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is how I understand it, the function of naming as an example of hypostasis, right? And those two things are actually not two different things.
They're not. Yeah. I'm aware of it. It's a unity.
So,
it's like there were two parts.
okay,
I just wanted to express them as separate, even though I know they're one. Actually, yeah, the one idea is that all things are held together through the name.
Well, the tetragrammaton is a name.
Right.
It's
Is
a
the name
name.
of God. Yeah.
Right.
It is
Right.
that name is both it's the principle of the unity and the differentiation of all things, which and that image is right there in the name itself.
Yes.
That's why the hey is repeated.
And
That's
it's
what it's
also
trying
why
to
you
show
can't
you.
say it, because how do you say that?
Right.
Like, we can't talk about it, right?
Yeah.
How do we talk about the one and the many? Like, this is like the age-old problem.
Right. It's the original and most difficult of philosophical problems.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that there's, I mean, I think like just in kind of absorbing, a few things that you're talking about, and I'm sure we'll get further into it. One of the things that's interesting to me that maybe is auxiliary to anything we talk about is just the nature of those kinds of impartations and how they arise, right? And that's kind of what I see that as, is when you stumble on something that you realize you didn't think of it and you didn't conceive of it, but it's a crystallizing moment, right? Where everything kind of gathers around that central thought, in a sense, that central impartation. Is there was probably multiple antecedents to that reality, right? And so John Baer talked about that in some of his works, where he talks about kind of the apocalyptic setting that Christ is being disclosed within. Is like there's all kinds of apocalyptic imagination and literature and concepts that are developing in Judaism of the time, and actually outside of Judaism, in Greco-Roman and into Persian thinking as well. Is Jesus is like Jesus is what crystallizes that supersaturated solution, and everything kind of coalesces around that disclosure, right? And all of a sudden things make sense. So I'm interested to know, kind of, when you have an impartation like that, what were the things that you were thinking about? What's in that solution, that supersaturated solution that allowed just a simple impartation to crystallize a lot of your thinking on this issue?
Well, yeah, definitely. So there's definitely, there's parts of like me, like having like these things that I've been reading kind of operating in my subconscious, or definitely plays a role here. I mean, I can definitely see the imprint of like some of the stuff we've been studying in Tomberg, like particularly as it relates to the name of God. And I was, right before bed, I was reading Jordan Daniel Wood's new book, The Whole Mystery of Christ, and which is really good. It's not
heavy on hypostatic logic.
heavy on hypostatic logic, and I would say it's not light reading, but it's worth the energy. Let's put it that way. It's really, really good. And the other thing I would say, the other part of my reflection that I haven't shared yet, is that there was it made me rethink. So it made me rethink about what was going on with the Adamic naming, because I had always assumed that it was something like delineating the genera, which is kind of how Mathieu Pajot.
There's also the idea that through the naming, man sees that he is alone. I know that's an Orthodox teaching in Catechism, for example.
Okay.
Is that when Adam, names all the animals, God doesn't name them for Adam, so that's interesting. And then when Adam names them, he realizes that he is alone. He doesn't. Right. He doesn't match any of the animals.
He doesn't match anything, which does line up with that interpretation of genera. So maybe that is that's what I would have said. But the thought occurred to me, and it's part of the same thing, is like, oh, the Adamic naming is not a naming of what a thing is. So it's not really establishing a category of like, this is a cat and this is a dog and this is a cow and this is a sheep. That, or at least it's not what it was supposed to be. Let me put it that way, perhaps. What it was supposed to be was delineating who they are. And I think that is a capacity that we lost.
So the naming within the naming is the personhood.
Right. And then part of the comment I made on Twitter was like, I think most people have lost this capacity for that. If this really is like, if there is a connection between Adamic naming and this idea of being able to name who something is, like,
So
to actually love it in a way that brings it into personhood, right?
yes, so do you think that in identifying the personhood of the thing through naming, does that create a bind between the two, the name, the person who, like the human being, for example, in the case of Adam, and the animal that he names?
I think the answer is yes, it would create a bond. And I don't want to get to my answer. The reason I say that has to do with some of the verses in Revelation that I want to get to talking about later. But I just wanted to say that like the only reason I was able even to consider that possibility is because of you. Because as soon as I said, I think basically almost all of us have lost this capacity for naming things as who instead of simply what. I said I would be willing to bet that every animal on Shari's farm, wild or domestic, has a name, that she knows not simply what they are, but who they are.
Mhm.
So I think that you can see where now maybe this is to give Machi Pajot his due, because I would have agreed with him entirely 100% up until I had that flash. Maybe that is maybe that is part of the differentiation between the role of Adam and the role of Eve. Maybe that is maybe the naming that is a naming of genera is the Adamic role, but the naming that is saying who something is the feminine role.
Well, there, like Jed was saying, there's two kinds of naming before, like the title of something and then the actual name of it. But there's also, I mean, I'm not as well informed on this, but I'm just gonna throw it out there. There's also God naming things
Yes.
and people naming.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I turned my camera off.
So if you mind, like, is it okay if I kind of riff a little bit? Just
yeah, absolutely.
A few of these concepts, like, so, once upon a time, I had to actually write a paper on naming, right? So
well, we have bumped into the right person.
I asked the right person.
Maybe not. But and this is really important as you kind of get into kind of the inner theological workings of especially the Hebrew scriptures, especially where naming is vital.
Yeah.
A name, it can be a title, right? So and like El or Elohim or El Elyon or El Shaddai, those may have had some quasi-personal function, but the way that the Hebrew Bible presents those to us, they tend to be more of a title or describing a function, right? But then you have like personal names, right? And personal names are vital in the scriptures because they establish a personal relationship, right? And so if we look at the divine name, you're to call upon the name of the Lord for the purpose of salvation, right? So the name of the Lord is disclosed in his saving acts, right? So what's interesting is regardless of what we make of the origins of the divine name of the Yod He Vav He of Yahweh, in the
Well, and
scripture,
then also his most intimate, acceptably pronounceable title in the Hebrew idiom is Hashem, the name.
the name,
Yeah.
right? And the name is called upon, right? And is established. The relationship is established with the person, and the personal character of the name is disclosed in its acts, in what it does, right? And so especially when we come into the divine name, it becomes, very important to establish, like, whatever we want to say the meaning of the name is, the divine name is establishing a who, which is the God of Israel, right? And this is who the people of Israel call upon, for the purpose of saving, for the purpose of memory, right? So they're invoking the name in worship, they're invoking the name in their oaths, right? So there's a sense where that the Lord is the kind of the guarantee or the guarantor of anything from covenants all the way down to how he is reflected in the personal names of his people, from like Joshua or Isaiah or all the different names that incorporate the divine name, right? And so there is a sense where the divine name is it opens up the possibility for a personal relationship, right? And so I think that is, I think, Nate, where you're talking about, the question of, are we?
Yeah, I think it establishes that person is the ground of everything, is what it establishes. That's
right.
What,
there is no concept of like a free floating divine essence in the scripture.
right. None.
Don't
whatsoever.
even get very many statements about the divine nature at all. The only one I can think of is in, is it in 1st or 2nd Peter, when it talks about us being partakers of the divine nature, right? I think that might be the only reference in scripture that actually speaks of the divine nature, right? When we're speaking of God in the scriptural testimony, it's always of a person, and a person who's called upon, who's worshiped, who's served, who acts on behalf of his people. Now, that doesn't take away from the multiplicity in the name, because obviously, there's at least ambiguity there as far as the nature of God's oneness. Is it a unity or is it a singularity? And I think the three of us are probably in agreement that that's speaking more to the unity principle than it is
it's a multi-unity, to use Bulgakov's phrase. And I
Yeah.
actually, some of my Jewish friends would agree with that.
Yeah. So I think that the name is it's an establishing of a relationship, and actually it's closely tied to another important biblical correlate, is the face.
Yeah.
Because the face is the disclosure of the personal identity, right? So all those biblical references to standing before something, well, that term before is lipane, which is literally means to the face.
Facing.
To the face. The face is what is being, you're before the face of the entity that you're addressing, or it's divine, angelic, human, or otherwise. It's face to face. So the Aaronic blessing of the Lord's face shining upon you is something that is tied to also the name, right? Because the name is what is being evoked, and the personal presence is being disclosed in the face.
Okay, so I've got Barfield just running around in circles in my head right now, because there's this really great part in Saving the Appearances on Israel. And I'm just going to read a little bit. He's just talking about, how hard it is to quote Barfield out of here, because he seems to just constantly be tying into other ideas, but I'll just start anyway. The third difference cannot be displayed in quite such a summary fashion. According to the Old Testament, shortly before the Israelites took their departure from Egypt, the name of the God of Israel was for the first time revealed to them through their representative Moses. And about this name, two things are to be particularly noted. It was regarded as, for the most part, too holy to be communicable. Thus, also in the Psalms, for instance, it will be found written where the word Lord or God is written in the Authorized Version, yet when it was read aloud, other names such as Adonai or Elohim were, at all events, by the 3rd century BC, vocally substituted. The name itself was pronounced only by the priests in the temple when blessing the people, or by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. Other precautions and uses emphasized and preserved its ineffable quality. Typographically, the name is represented by 4 Hebrew consonants. Etymologically, it represents a slight modification of the Hebrew verb to be, which also suggested to breathe. In Exodus 3:14, the first revelation, the first person singular of this verb, YHYH, occurs twice as the verb I am that I am, and once as a noun, thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am, hath sent me unto you. In the following verse, the third person, YHYH, perhaps the nearest equivalent in English sounds of the so-called tetragrammaton, is substituted. And the verse is, and God said moreover unto Moses, thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, tetragrammaton, God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, hath sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. The Hebrew word for Jew may similarly be rendered YHWDI. The texture of the language hints that a devout Jew could hardly name his race without tending to utter the tetragrammaton. Written as all Hebrew words were without vowels, when any true child of Israel perused the unspoken name, tetragrammaton may have seemed to come whispering up, as it were, from the depths of his own being. Now, this is the really interesting part. That this or something like it was increasingly the case is at least suggested by the progress we note between the account in Exodus 3 of the experience of Moses and that given in 1 Kings XIX, whatever that is, of the experience of Elijah on the occasions of their encounters with God. The angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire and out of the midst of a bush, and then the Lord himself called to Moses out of the midst of the same bush. But by the time of Elijah, the withdrawal of Israel from participation was already far advanced, and we are given instead, in the well-known verses, a crescendo of appearances in which each of which God was not. And then the verse is, and behold, and then it's the tetragrammaton, passed by, and a great strong wind rent the mountains and brake in pieces the rocks before tetragrammaton. But tetragrammaton was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake, but tetragrammaton was not in the earthquake, and after the earthquake a fire, but tetragrammaton was not in the fire, and after the fire a still small voice, ... So this is the part that I love. This ingathering withdrawal from participation to which the Old Testament points was clearly then a very different matter from that ousting or suppression of participation which Alpha thinking has subsequently accomplished in the Western world. Indeed, it might with equal truth be described as a concentration or centripetal deepening of participation. As to the glories displayed in the 104th Psalm, God was no longer in them. They were no longer his representations or names, for he had now only one name, I am, and that was participated by every being who had eyes that saw and ears that heard, and who spoke through his throat. But it was incommunicable because its participation by the particular self, which is at this moment uttering, it was an inseparable part of its meaning, right? So like the name became a part of the person, right? Everyone can call his idol God, and many do, but no being who speaks through his throat can call a wholly other and outer being I. Herein lay the mystery of the divine name. It was that name in which there is no participation between the Creator and anything else. So wrote the renowned Jewish Rabbi Maimonides in about the year 1190. And again, all the names of the Creator, quote, all the names of the Creator which are found in books are taken from his works, except one name, the Tetragrammaton, which is proper to him, and is therefore called the name apart, because it signifies the substance of the Creator by pure signification, in which there is no participation. His other glorious names do indeed signify by participation, because they are taken from his works. So I guess what I'm saying, because I'm thinking, the whole time you guys are talking, I'm thinking about the relationship between the tetragrammaton and this hypostasis, right? Because there is one, that's why you had that thought. And I think Barfield puts it together when he talks about, because the withdrawal from participation for Barfield was when God told them not to worship idols anymore. Okay, that's the withdrawal. And when that happened, he gave them his name, and his name became a part of their name, and they couldn't utter it.
Which is to prepare the way for Christ, because Christ unifies the divine and the human under the same hypostasis.
Right.
So that's why participation needed to withdraw, because you cannot see.
Well,
if the world is full of God, if you see the world is full of gods, you will be too distracted to be able to come to the recognition of your co-identity with the divine through Christ.
Right. And so, like Barfield says it so well, the ingathering of participation.
Yeah, the ingathering. Yeah.
The ingathering. So it became,
I've read that passage like at least 4 times, and there are a couple things, like I saw it very clearly for the first time what he was saying there. So thank you for sharing that. And then the other thing is that, here's the interesting bit. There was part of my story I didn't tell you. My immediate instinct after I went into my office and kind of like wanted to sit with this thought for a little bit before I tried to go back to sleep. And the first thing I instinctively did was pray the name of God in a very, like, in a below a whisper breathing rhythm.
wow. Okay,
And
now
Barfield ties it to the idea of breath in that passage.
yes. Yeah. So I had a weird experience last night right before I was going to bed. I was doing my nightly routine, closing blinds, shutting off lights, and I passed by my icon corner, and it was like, if it could have been a booming voice, it would have, or a giant earth magnet or something like that, right? Was come and pray, come and it wasn't like I needed to pray about something, or there was we were in some kind of distress, but it was an invitation. I felt like this huge invitation, right? And it was just to be together in his name.
Right. Well,
So
because
that's really
because here's the thing, like that's the movement of final participation, right? Is you're drawn in, so you no longer can like look at the world and see the world as full of gods. So you, like, in the more healthy Hebrew form of withdrawal of participation, you're drawn into the interior, right? To encounter God within your within your inner being, right? Because the only place left to go to find God is inside. If the world is no longer full of gods. But then once that recognition is made, then you're able to immediately to return to the participatory mode and see God revealed in all things once again.
This
without losing a sense of your own identity.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think that there's, like, I think that the way that like world religions and philosophical systems have struggled with this is we tend to resort to a certain kind of abstraction, away from the personal.
Yeah.
And I think that it actually ends up obscuring the nature of the actual divine nature, right? Which is personal. It's all personal, but personal can only ever be expressed in and through person. So for example, Shari, Nate, Jed are all personal names of, we are, through which our human nature is actualized.
Mhm.
But the manner in which Shari personalizes, actualizes that personal identity of the human is going to look different than the way that Jed does.
Absolutely. Yes, this is 100% critical. That's why this is why it's so dangerous to try to reduce everything to these like precise formula, because the reality is that there are as many different ways of incarnating the logos as there are hypostases capable of doing it. There's no one way to do it.
But there's okay, I just want to touch on this. I'd love to hear your thoughts. There's a something on the outside that calls to something on the inside that actually isn't you. Okay.
Oh, can you elaborate a little more on what you're saying there?
And notice that I said what I said at the beginning. I said I felt like I was overhearing a conversation of the angels, right? I knew that thought wasn't coming from me. So that's definitely like that's definitely 100% part of it. But yeah, like Jed, I really want to hear you elaborate on that.
Well, to me, this is what Sophia, and I'm not going to be able to articulate this, but maybe you can jump in and grab it for me, because I know you already know this. I just don't know if you know it in this context. This is Sophia, the creaturely Sophia, and the divine Sophia. This is what I'm talking about, right? So you have Sophia within, right, the creaturely, and you have the divine Sophia. And Soloviev talks about this quite a bit, where, I should get that. I'll do it after. I'll find that little poem that he wrote. But where you can be looking at this is what Soloviev, how he does it. He looks at the stars and they shine on him, and then he shines on them. Okay? So this is to me, this is what Sophiology is all about, right? Is it that you have this thing on the outside that calls to the thing on the inside, and I don't know what else to call it, so I'm going to call it a thing. And and it's what gives the opportunity, let's say, maybe, for this hypostasis, for this binding together, because, and it has to do with Heidegger's idea of disclosure. Like, what's the Greek word he used? Aletheia, where it's not like something that never was. It's something that always was, and always will be, right? But you have to disclose it, like you have to unveil it, right? So and this gets to that whole idea of thin places that we talked about the other day briefly, right? That there's this longing from the divine for this marriage, and yeah, that's my best attempt, Nate.
No, that's good. That's good, because I think that what you're talking about, and it's something that's notoriously difficult to talk about, especially if you want to try to do it in a propositional way, because what I sense that you're talking about is the divine feminine itself. That's what
Sophia.
you're talking, right?
Yeah.
So, and that is associated with the earth. It's in the earth. So that's why you're saying it's like the outside, right? So that's what I'm saying. That was the movement I was talking about when you're called back into participation. Sophia is the fullness of what you are called to participate with when you awaken to that identity that you find by going inside through the healthy withdrawal participation. You find that identification on the inside, and then that is what you are then able to interact with. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, maybe I have it mixed up, And I don't know if I'm wrong,
I
Tam.
know I don't know that I have it right either. This is
Okay. Because like to me, the creaturely Sophia resides within me, and the divine Sophia is without. It's yeah. I mean, it's the cosmos, but I'm a microcosm, right?
right.
So
Yeah, it's like
but
the
I
thing
don't know
that
if I have that right. Maybe I
no,
have
no, because I know I've said the same idea, because that was the idea that I was actually. Did you hear my conversation with Dr. Milliner?
yes.
Okay, and I talked about what I said to Vervaeke
Yep.
about how we need to also imitate Mary, because we need to become a
Yep.
womb in which to, right? So these processes, it's not like they interact with each other. And that's what we're having a hard time articulating, is like
Yeah, because
it's not like a recipe for baking a cake.
well, before all of our conversations and reading, I called this simultaneous reciprocity.
Well,
That's what I called it.
Right. It's related to what Vervaeke talks about when he talks about why you need to have both meditation and contemplation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's two ways of talking about the same kind of interior exterior movement, like going and in some ways going down into the lowest depths and going up into the highest heights.
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to find Sophia.
So there's a couple of controlling metaphors I want to introduce into this kind of fun little constellation of ideas that we're talking about. I think as you're describing some of these things, Nate, and you as well, Shari, is that you're hitting on something that I encounter in my meditation time.
Okay.
And I want to.
Can I say one thing really quick before I lose it?
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
So Sophia, I think Bulgakov actually does this, and I think I see very clearly why. Like he wants to associate Sophia with the ousia, with the substance part of God, with the essence of God. So I think that the hypostatic principle, right, which is Christ, that is what we're talking about in the elevated portion, but that substrate is related to the ousia, which is related to Sophia, which is why you have. So they're these two opposite poles, but they're all part of the same divinity.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's very much connects, especially to the inner created Sophia and the outer uncreated Sophia, divine Sophia.
That's right. Good. That's better. Yeah.
So the one of the things I want to look at is the idea of surface tension, right? The surface tension of like a reflective pool of water, and is that surface is the name that can disclose the depths beneath and reflect whatever is occurring above, right? So that's kind of the picture I want to start playing with a little bit. So when I meditate in the third heaven, which is the heaven of gnosis, right? I'm sorry, not the third, the fifth. Third would be here. Would be the heaven of counsel. But the fifth heaven, which is right below the middle, I use the chakra system, so it would be corresponding to the navel or the solar plexus, right? The gut. When I go into that, like, and this is kind of what I see when I go in there, right? Is usually accompanied by some sort of visual representation of Sophia, right? So usually is like a six-winged seraph in this case. And I'll be taken into a place that is a large manicured garden, right? So think of like something you might see at Versailles, right? So not so much like a wild English garden, but something that's very well kept, manicured. Trees are trimmed, hedges are made into beautiful, lovely shapes. And in the middle of this garden is a large, elongated pool, like not a pond or anything like that, an actual, like a constructed pool of infinite depth. So it just goes on down into forever, right? And then beyond, at the very end of the pool, stands the tree of life, right? And when I see the tree of life, it looks something much like an oak tree, but whose fruits are kind of shining in a way that it encompasses like the 7 colors of the rainbow. Like it's got this brilliant, kind of like if you've seen the recent Rings of Power episodes that have been on Amazon Prime, when we see the trees in Valinor, like they shine. There's these brilliant shining tree. And my first time meditating in this particular location, right, was I was invited by Sophia to look into the pool, right, and I couldn't see anything. All I could see was just kind of like what you would see if you look into a dark pool at twilight, right? Is you just kind of see the dark depths that reside underneath.
So not Crater Lake.
Yeah, not Crater Lake. More of like, more of like seeing through a glass dimly kind of thing. But then like she would invite me to look further. Like, what am I looking at? And what I would see in the depths is I finally was able to see myself. Right. And what emerged from the depths was like a mirror image, a crystalline kind of watery structure of myself that emerges from the depths and becomes visible, standing above the pool, standing kind of face to me. And what I'm seeing is, oh, that's me in all of my transparent reality that is transparent to God, to Sophia, to the whole realm that is in this heavenly meditation. Right. But the reflective property of those pools themselves makes me think of like that surface tension between sky and water functions in a way that is similar to a name, where an identity is disclosed. What is in the depths is then reflected above, and what is above is reflected below. And so there's this kind of this horizon or meeting point of 2 different modes of reality, the mode from the depths and the mode from the heights kind of thing. And so I think that like the name is
heaven and earth.
It's a Sophianic disclosure, if we want to put it in Bulgakov's terms, right? It is the meeting point of the creaturely and the divine,
which is a thin place. That's why you have a mirror thing going on and a surface tension, right? And yeah, I found the poem from Soloviev that kind of illustrates this within and without, reciprocal thing that's going on.
Can I just say one thing, since you said that? Just the name is the disclosure to the heights of what resides within the depths.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah. I mean, this is Douglas Harding is like reverberating in the background of my mind right now, because this is what he's talking about all the time, right? Okay, so you gaze at the stars, you, my bright star. Oh, if I were but the sky to hold you, in broad embraces and with a myriad of eyes, to feast upon you in wordless radiance. Now I think that I got the wrong thing here. No, I don't.
That's
you
good.
Gaze at the star, you, my bright star. If I were but the sky to hold you in broad embraces and with a myriad of eyes to feast upon you in wordless radiance. Yeah, so it's like he's staring at this, Sophia, right? The bright star, but then he becomes radiant through that process. And which is kind of like, just comes to my mind now. This is kind of like
it's really about knowing too, because like in the spiritual dimension, realm, whatever you want to call it, in the spiritual register, seeing and knowing are one. That's why angelic beings are always described as being covered with eyes. So I had someone ask me, someone on Twitter recently, like, was asking about like the transfiguration, like how did they know it was Moses and Elijah? And I just answered to me as obvious, like, because they weren't seeing with the eyes of the body.
Well, this is
They
like
they would not have known with certainty it was Moses and Elijah if it was the eyes of the body with which they were seeing. They would have known that they saw two people who they weren't sure who they were. Because they knew that it was Moses and Elijah that were standing there with Christ in the transfiguration, that tells you that they were seeing with the eyes of the Spirit.
Mhm.
And in the Spirit, knowing and seeing are one act. So of course you would know it was Moses and Elijah. How could you not know? Because it's a unified act.
I think, yeah, I think if you did see with your eyes, you wouldn't know. Is what you're
Right, exactly. That's exactly right. Yes,
But
if you were
doesn't
relying on your eyes, you'll never see.
John Boyd does that. He has that fun little like thought exercise that he plays with his students where he talks about, would you recognize Jesus in AD 30? He's like walking down the street at the local Starbucks in Jerusalem, and it's like, if you would have recognized him, you would have been a demon, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right.
Because they were the
Right.
only ones who really knew who he actually was. So it's not with the eyes.
Right, because they're spiritual beings. So that for them, it's the same thing. Seeing and knowing are one act.
Right. And I think, like, to kind of back up on just the interesting picture there of the transfiguration, right, is that is mirrored in Revelation 11,
Mm-hmm.
right, where the ascended Christ is still being witnessed to by Elijah and Moses.
Right.
And so
well, I was thinking about this too. I was thinking about recently when I've been praying the rosary, and I've been contemplating on the mystery of the Ascension while praying the rosary. And the first part of that of that verse, it says, "Why do you look up in the sky?" Before it says Jesus will return in the same way that you saw him leave, it says, "Why do you look up into the sky?" So what does that say? That tells you whatever is meant by the ascension into heaven, it wasn't a raising up into, it wasn't a physicalist raising up into the sky that's being referred to. Otherwise, the verse wouldn't begin with, "Why do you look up into the sky?"
Yeah.
It's not where heaven is.
I mean, Jesus wasn't a rocket ship.
No.
Yeah, I think, Nate, like what this becomes like really interesting to kind of segue into some of the other like domains that you're already have brought up, is that the name is the disclosure of the personal identity, right? And it opens up the possibility of a relationship. But as we look into those Revelation texts that speak of new names,
Yes, which we haven't got to yet.
right? And that
so we have Revelation 2:17, which is the white stone name. And then we have Revelation 3:12, which is the really strange one because it talks about the city having a new name and Christ having a new name. Do either of you have any immediate thoughts about, in the context of this conversation on all the themes we've been bringing out, about the meaning of those verses? I've already given, I gave my views before we started recording, so I'm much more interested in hearing what other people have to say.
I mean, those are, yeah, I'll let Shari, you go ahead and jump in. Because I'll probably be thinking and talking at the same time. So,
well, I don't have any like grand theological statements to make here, but what I think is, like the white stone, the way that the white stone name is described, you get this image of God writing your name on a stone and putting it on your forehead. And with that, as soon as it touches you, which I think is really important, because that's the glue again, right? There's a binding that happens. As soon as it touches you, you realize that that's who you always were. Okay, it's not like, oh, this is my new name, and now
every time Shari says I don't have anything really great and theological to say, she drops some sort of wisdom bomb and acts like it was nothing.
Yeah.
So so that's what that, to me, that's what that is. It's like all of a sudden your identity aligns perfectly with why God created you. Like everything, the stars align, if you want to put it in those terms, like everything just kind of goes click, right?
Mhm.
And then the idea of Christ getting a new name and the city getting a new name, to me, that's about, I mean, I haven't given that as much thought, to be honest, but it seems
So
like
next to something you just said.
well, yeah, it's like a realization of its fullest potential, right? Of the thing that it always was.
And I think that's like, it's, when I read through McDonald's sermon on the name written on the stone, right? So for Revelation chapter 2, and when I'm thinking about some of the things that we're talking about here, is it's new with respect to time,
Yeah,
but with respect to eternity, it's what has always been,
yeah,
right? And so it is, in a sense, everybody has that new name. In fact, those, I believe, are the names that are written on in the book of life.
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
So if your name here does not have cohesion with your name there, you're in
Not
trouble,
there yet.
right? Because you have missed your ability to operate from that true sense of identity that you have always been.
Mhm.
And so it's the name of who and what you are as a creature, with all of its potentiality expressed in that new or even possibly original name, right? And so I think when we're looking at some of the questions of the new city of Jerusalem that has a new name, Jesus disclosing a new name, even though he already possesses a name that is above every name, it's the fullness of disclosure.
Mhm. Yeah, it's that
it's
veil totally removed.
the depths become totally and utterly transparent.
It's also that surface tension that you talked about is gone, right? Like
Mhm.
I know that this is not what a lot of things that I read talk about, but this is what I think the crystal sea it is. Like it's literally the idea that everything has become unified, like the crystal is made from sand, right? Like glass. And sand is like the ultimate multiplicity. Like it just doesn't hold together.
Mhm.
Sand does not hold together.
Mm.
But once it's crystallized, it's fused and it's clear. It's all those words that we use, and this, George MacDonald comes to mind, where he talks about, we use, nature is the wardrobe with which we clothe our thoughts, right? And yet those thoughts are the thoughts that this is like, it's so ridiculous because it's like, now we're in the imagination of God, because he made the sand and he made the glass and he made, right, us. We had to go out and find those things, those metaphors, in order to understand what's going on. And that is, again, that relationship, to me, between the creaturely and the divine Sophia. It's an aletheia, it's a disclosure, right, of the thing that always was. It's always been.
The only thing I would add is the thing that I said to Jed before we started recording, which is I think that the new name of Christ that was referred to in Revelation 3:12 is actually referring back to the white stone name that was given back in Revelation 2:17, because your identity and the identity of Christ are now completely interchangeable.
Well, yeah. And I mean, to me, like, after going through the book of Job with Jess, like, Job is humanity and he is Christ.
Right.
Right. And that's what we are. Like, you're gods,
And
so it's like we are, the whole purpose of humanity is to be like Christ.
which is to mediate between heaven and earth properly.
Right. Hello. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, and
Which
so
is why the city has a new name, I think. I think that's it right there, because that's that
Well, Jesus said, behold, I make all things new.
right.
Right. So, but it doesn't mean that they, like, this is the interesting thing I find. Jess did this great little thing in the last Job conversation that we had, where he talked about God treading down enemies and trampling and blah, 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 right? The wicked. But how he does it is that he makes Job the mediator for them. Oh, this is trampling.
Right. It's like the way right. It's exactly the way Tom Berg talks about in Meditations of Tarot, when he talks about the only way to conquer an enemy, to truly conquer an enemy, is to turn them into a friend.
Right.
You can defeat an enemy, but you don't truly conquer an enemy until you transform them into a friend.
Right. And so the biblical language is trampling and treading on and destroying the wicked, but it's done by giving them a way through, right? A mediator. So we get caught up in all this destruction language, and it's not destruction language, it's transformative language.
That reminds me of another thing that came up in the Jordan Peterson Machu Picchu conversation that I thought, like, I think I knew what Machu wanted to say, but he left himself open to very bad interpretation, because he was talking about all of the patterns of stories in the Hebrew Bible, where one is cautioned against uniting together with the enemy. But that's almost always driven by eros. He used the example of Samson, right? And in case of Samson, it's definitely, this is a eros driven. But eros is it's a kind of love that is related to the desire to consume, right? To unite with fully. But that's not what divine love. That's not what the fullness of divine love is. Fullness of divine love is agape. So it sounded like, the way he talked about it, it sounded like he was directly contradicting Christ when Christ says love your enemies, because he didn't draw that distinction between eros and agape, which I think he would hold, and I think he would understand, but he left himself open to bad interpretation, particularly given the audience that heard that, with it being on Daily Wire, which is going to take that as an excuse to, like, yeah, we don't want to unite with our enemies, yeah, screw those guys, so I really thought that could have deserved a little bit of clarification. So,
well, yeah. So I think, like I'm like, I don't follow Peugeot or Jordan Peterson or that much. Like, it's just because.
And this is Machu Picchu. I'm talking about his brother.
So his brother, and not to say that they don't have interesting things to say. But I think, like, what you're talking about, and what Shari is, joining us in here, is, to me, what's interesting about it is, like, is to go back into Genesis chapter 2 and ask again the question, what is Adam doing? Right? Because I think that the question of naming is tied to so much, to perceiving, so it's tied to our seeing, it's tied to our knowing, it's tied to so many different things.
I think it also, don't you think, like, I don't know about any biblical reference, I'm just thinking about my own experience with naming. It also imparts something. It's like a blessing and a curse, right? When you name something, it gifts the person receiving that name those attributes.
Right, like the naming of Israel.
Or you can curse them, right? You can give somebody a negative nickname.
Yeah.
That, like, points out their negative traits.
Either, Book of Isaiah, Book of Hosea, both do this, right? Right. When the children of Gomer were, one of the names was Lo Amni, not my people. who then is renamed Amni, my people, right?
Mm.
Or you know, the naming of Emmanuel in conjunction with the other names, which I can say them, but it's a mouthful. But some names can function in the overall structure of blessing and cursing. So it is an impartation.
Yeah.
And a name is a gift.
But what's so interesting is, I think maybe it wasn't as prevalent in biblical times because they were more aware of the meaning of names and they named for those reasons. But today, I've had the experience of knowing people who were named something and they were true to their name, even though nobody knew what their name meant. It just was a name. It was a name, and they, you know, it was grandpa's name or it was so whatever, right?
Yeah,
And
I
yet,
remember Paul Vanderklay in his video today was like expressing his discomfort with people renaming themselves.
oh, interesting.
Right. You know, like,
Yeah.
and I think he was talking about Kanye, who now wants to be called Ye or whatever. But can't I don't know, can we name ourselves?
So I would say, I think that it is,
I sympathize with that idea of not wanting people to name it themselves,
I,
because names
well,
are given, right?
well, in a sense they are, but like, I think there's also like ample biblical evidence of taking new names, right? Whether they're given or taken, right?
Yeah.
Wait, give me I can't think of an example where one was taken, like was self-given.
I
Off the top of
would
my head, can you give me an example?
I would say like we have no, like, if I would use Paul would probably be an example of a likelihood of taking on that new name on his own, right? Taking on the new identity. Now we don't have biblical evidence of that as far as how he came to the name Paul from Saul. So I'm just trying to think in terms of
You find it interesting that Moses didn't get a name change?
Well, I mean, Saul and Paul are kind of like mirror names, right? Because Saul
Right.
was chosen as king because he was the tallest,
Mm-hmm.
and Paulos means small.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a play on his previous name.
So Abraham was given from Abram,
Yeah.
right? Jacob was given from Jacob. I mean, Israel was given
Yeah.
from Jacob. And so there's plenty of instances where you know, a new name is given. And I think that it's, you know, typically a new name is probably,
Yeah, I gotta say the preeminent example of someone trying to take their own name, though, would be like Lucifer himself, right? Who wants to take the divine name for himself by force.
right. So let's use, like, for example, like in our practice, or at least some Christian practices of conferring a Christian name, right? Your name you receive at baptism, which isn't always the name you go by, but it's a name that's given.
Mm-hmm.
Is when somebody goes through a transformational event, typically a new name is in order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so,
I know there's no argument about that, but usually it's others that see something and give it to that name to us.
Yeah.
We don't normally like seize it for ourselves.
right.
Although, I mean, I'm my name is Nathaniel, right? I went by Nathan for most of the early part of my life, and then when I started working in sales, I started going by Nate because it's shorter and friendlier and more approachable. So like I very consciously chose a different form of my own name for a very specific reason, and then I just kind of I liked it, so I stuck with it ever since. So I've gone by Nate ever since, but I used to be a Nathan.
Mhm. Yeah, and so my sense on that is that typically, like in our contemporary context, the naming is also, you know, accompanying gender issues, right? So take a new name along with the new gender, right? And I'm not going to comment on the validity or
I
invalidity.
wasn't even thinking about that.
That was so far from my thoughts.
But that happens, right? So
Yeah.
taking a new name is a part of a conferring of a new identity, whether that's driven by somebody who's choosing a name for themselves or is been given a name by somebody else. But I think, like, in terms of like the validity of the name, right? people will change, in other cultural contexts. Like if you're baptized as a Christian, you take on a new name, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it oftentimes, like if you have a name that was, in reverence of some foreign god, then they'll take on, like the name of an apostle or an Old Testament saint or whatever it is, to in that sense of new identity. And that's something that is kind of assumed in the process of conversion, those kinds of things.
Even in Catholicism, you choose your own confirmation name.
Right.
So that's an example of a Christian accepted, authorized choosing of a name.
Do you just choose a name, or do you?
No, it's always the name of a saint, right?
Yeah.
So it's always the name of a saint with whom you feel a special connection. So mine is Thomas.
Yeah. So the taking
Or
on
Aquinas, not the doubting Thomas.
Mhm. And so I think, the more interesting thing is not whether a name changes or not, but the underlying identity of the name itself is vitally important. And I think like apocalyptically important, because the name is the disclosure. Right?
Do you think that there's anything to be said from that is valid within a Christian or biblical context about the kind of like occult numerological idea that to change one's name is to change one's fate?
Oh, I think there's something to that.
I've never put any thought into that. So I would be dangerous,
and that's just intuitive for me.
Dangerous for me to say anything other than, yeah, I probably think that there's something to that.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want to speculate as to what. But I would say that it's probably not a completely vacuous concept. But I don't believe in the sort of rigid fatalism that would make that true in an absolute sense, though. That's for sure.
So
let's say that your name is. Let's say that we can validly consider your name an influence.
Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah, and I think so. Like, what kind of filters into my thinking of the importance of the name, whether you're taking a new name or you're expressing the one that your given name, right? In kind of one of those impartation type moments. And I've talked about this in other settings too, so it shouldn't be anything terribly new. But what I was seeing was kind of the furtherance of the Pentecostal promise that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, right? And so I was seeing that in a very visual, visionary kind of internal sort of sight, right? And it was one of those everything all at once kind of experiences, where the spirit was descending on the earth. Like the earth looked like one of those nighttime shots from outer space, right? So the mostly dark, but you could make out the contours of the continents that were different than the oceans, and then you could see lights, kind of like city lights, right? And these little lights were lighting up the world, right? And as I was looking further into that, I was kind of in this kind of dialogue, where I was like, well, who are these people, right? That were kind of in this kind of eschatological epoch, or this apocalyptic epoch. Who are these people that are lighting up the world that is enveloped with darkness? And they were, in a sense, receiving this light that was pouring down from heaven, kind of like a white light that was coming down and enveloping a dark earth. And then these lights were popping up like city lights almost throughout the globe. And I was seeing people. And then I heard, just look no further than their name. Right. And what it did for me in that experience was to see that, like, rarely are names haphazardly given. So I don't think it's good to just change a name haphazardly.
Okay, I think we can all agree on that.
So but
I wouldn't say, I would say that's probably the most sensible position, is like, I wouldn't say it's universally always a bad idea to change your name. It certainly is a bad idea to change your name haphazardly.
Right. I just like the way that this name sounds. Is not, we tend to name in those ways, but that's not really the idea of biblical naming, or really the naming that took place for most of human history, right? Names disclosed a kind of a personal meaning. You see that in like the names of the first peoples here in the Americas, right?
Right.
Is there the disclosure that's in the name, like where I saw people taking on new names is when sometimes like where you're named carelessly, or maybe given a name that, is dark or
People can be
malicious.
named hatefully.
Yeah. So like a parent who names their kid Adolf Hitler, that's a name worth changing.
Oh yeah.
So when you're looking at a name, like whether it's received or you're taking on a new name, is this disclosure of an identity through which the creative activity that God is doing in the world is being actualized. Like it's being the work of the kingdom is being accomplished at a very personal level in and through persons, right? That have a determinate content that is disclosed in their name, right? Maybe an endlessly mysterious content, but it's not no content.
Right.
You know what I mean? There's something that it's referring to. And so the naming aspect that I think we lose sight of is, in our contemporary setting, more often than not, a parent names their kid something, sometimes for what the name means, but a lot of times it's just, I like the way the name sounds.
Right.
And I'm not going to say that that's wrong to do, but it certainly wouldn't be inappropriate for someone to say, well, maybe there's a name out there that fits, is a better designation of my identity. Right. And so I think that the activity of the Spirit is working in and through persons, which is going to presuppose.
I think it also could work in
personal names.
The person who says, I like the way it sounds.
Of course. And I don't want to be overly critical of that.
No,
That's
because
I'm not criticizing you or anything, Jed, but I guess what I was saying before, when I was saying that, when you give someone a name, you also impart a quality to them. You impart something to them, and you may not even be aware. The only thing that motivated you to impart that name was the way that it rang in your head, or the fact that it was attached to a fond memory, or right. And all those things are, to me, are ways of communicating.
I'm very concerned with the sound of things.
For the other side, the other side of the thin place, right? So the divine is like, okay, how do I get this person to name this other person this name, because it's important? Well, I'm gonna just remind them of how beautiful it sounds, right? And because it's like the divine, this is the you can't see God, right? That this is what this is. You can't see God. So he has to communicate to you in these cryptic ways, that you think are maybe even your own ideas. And this is what I love about George MacDonald's imagination essay, right? That we are just a thought of God. Like we are whirling around in his imagination, right? We're steeped in him. And it's okay if we think that the thing is ours. It's okay. I don't know how, like, yeah, so that's what I think is happening when somebody gets something from another person, right? Because of the divine and the creaturely Sophia that is within everyone, and this is why I am always saying everything needs to touch. We all need to be touching each other in some way, because when we do, all of that is it joins it together. I don't know how to say this. It joins this. It enables it. We are individuals. We are one, but we are actually many, but we are also one. You see, and so when we know who we are, it is when we are the many that are one. And that is why, I think this is the best I can do, we need to touch. You know,
touch.
we need to be touching. And we can touch psychically, we can touch spiritually, and we can touch physically.
Right.
And that's why I don't care how it gets done.
Let me ask you a question, Shari.
If we're doing this online, that's great. Like, it doesn't matter to me. You know, all this talk, I'm going to throw this, all this talk of in real life, oh, we really just need to be embodied. We're crossing out possibilities to touch people.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I absolutely agree with. I agree with you.
Yeah.
To drill in on the concept that you're talking about, so needing to touch, what would be the negation of that? What is not touching?
Individualism. Like? Individualism. The idea that you are autonomous, that you don't, that and that if you were gone, nothing would change. That's such a delusion.
That if you were gone, nothing would
like
change.
In the Beatles, like when the Beatles, you know, I'm a rock, I'm an island, right? Which is a repudiation of John Donne's, you know, beautiful poem. It says no man is an island, right?
Right.
Well, see, you know, like I talked about this briefly and I didn't elaborate on it much, but you know, how did I put that? It was in that last conversation with Jess on Job. I was thinking about the whole concept of annihilation and thinking, well, you know, if you think that you can annihilate, which means just to like completely erase from existence a person, and the rest of creation would remain, it can't happen. You would have to completely erase the memory of all of creation.
Right, because you've misthought what a person is.
Well, the thing is that one person, just think about it in these terms. If I look up into the sky, I attract a photon from outer space into my eyes.
Right.
Okay, so I've already caused a ripple in the cosmos.
And any meaningful understanding of what Shari is has to involve a complex system of relationships that nobody else has the exact same system of relationships that you do. And to remove you from the equation would have a ripple effect on every single one of those relations, reverberating in a way that we can't even fathom.
No.
Well, this could be taken in some wildly irresponsible ways, and I'll hazard the statement anyway. To annihilate a person is to remove from the universe the most important thing.
Yeah.
Any person. Because what is a person but a living expression and an imaging forth of God uniquely into creation?
Yeah. It's how person is the power by which anything exists. That's why I was like, that's like when I was listening to, I don't know why. Everybody was talking.
The universe could not be the universe without you.
That's precisely right. No, and this is I heard a rabbi once who was actually talking about the importance of birthdays, and he actually talked about the importance of name in this in the process of this conversation. But he was talking about the importance of birthdays was his general theme, and he was on YouTube. He's a rabbi who happens to be a student of Kabbalah. And he was saying that, like, God decided that you must exist.
Mm-hmm.
Not that you can exist, but you must exist. Like, in order for the universe to continue to be sustained in being by God, you had to come into it. And that is true of every single human being who has ever lived. Like, you are a necessary part of the divine plan.
Mm-hmm. And that's what, you know, of course I have to think about Job here, right? Because in the very beginning, he says, I wish that I was never born.
Yeah.
Like, he has this idea, he knows that in order for, because there's an aspect to Job that makes him responsible for a whole country. Okay.
Right.
He's He's got all this wealth, and that wealth is distributed, right? So when something catastrophic happens to Job, it's basically going to starve and impoverish thousands of other people. Okay.
Right.
So his idea is that, well, it's probably better that I would never
have been born, because he
never.
sees, if only he is removed, he sees what the repercussions of that are. So
Yeah.
it's like the only thing that he can will is that he never have existed at all.
But at the very end of Job, he says, I didn't know what I was talking about.
Right.
And I said, and I thought I understood things too wonderful for me. Okay.
Right.
So, and he said that he saw God, right? I've heard of you, but now I have seen you. But this is what you were talking about in the beginning, Nate, when this idea of knowing, right? He didn't see God with his eyes. He
Right.
knew God, right? With spiritual eyes. And
Right.
and he understood where what the significance of his existence was. That's what gave him closure, even in his complete suffering. And all of this annihilation and treading down and destroying conversation that you get in Job, for example, has nothing to do with the removal of a person from the universe and the memory of their existence. It has everything to do with the wood, hay, and stubble, the wheat and the chaff, right? All of that kind of conversation. So that is gone. And it's always transformational language. Always. You know?
Well, and if you think about, like, kind of in our kind of materialistic and individualistic age, what we do when we diminish ourselves, when we think that the world will spin on just fine without us, right? And that, we came from nothing, we pass back into nothing, kind of thing, is it's a downgrading and a diminishing of what a creature is, right? And it's a forfeiture of a fundamental inheritance.
But the only coherent understanding of nothing as the only true no thing is a person. It's a person, because the person is the only thing that is able to even begin to conceptualize that.
Yeah, I had that conversation with my daughter this weekend. She was asking, did God do we come from nothing, or do we come from God? I was like, yes.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah, right. Yeah.
And it's a great question. She asked these fun, curious little questions, but that was one of them. Do we come from nothing, or do we come from God? Yeah, we do.
Yeah, right.
And she wasn't very satisfied with my answer, but I'll let her sit with that one for a while. But the but the idea that we can kind of re-envelop ourselves in some sort of, absolute void or nothingness, devoid of any real content, devoid of our own histories or our own futures and all that kind of stuff. It's a sad thing. And I think it's maybe, Barfield might have some things to say about that as well. Right? As far as where that lands us on the final, borderlands of withdrawn participation.
Yeah.
We're
at the end of it.
We can no longer even name ourselves.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we don't have a name. We're like the hollow men in Eliot's poem. Like there's nothing left. And what that signifies to me, like on the hopeful sense, is that, in all of our civilizational striving, we come closer and closer to the edges of that nothing that we don't know how to name anymore.
Yeah.
But it does have a name, right? The no thing, the thing beyond all things, has a name and has disclosed himself in a name that we can call upon for our salvation. And ultimately is the same thing as calling upon the name of your own creator, right?
But
Is that
as
the-
Barfield points out so wonderfully in that thing that I read, is that you cannot say your own name without the Creator's name coming up from within you.
Mhm.
This is the beauty of what he said there, right?
Right, which allows
So,
you to see,
you know,
allows you to see how you're an echo of it.
right, in a mirror of it.
Mhm. I think that is a great place to put a wrap on it because I have to make dinner for my family. It's almost 6
And the
o'clock.
Padres are playing in the National League.
Oh yeah, we wouldn't
Oh.
want to miss you to miss. We wouldn't want you to miss the Padres game. Go Padres!
Go
Well,
Padres.
this was great. I'm glad.
Yeah.
Thanks for including me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a lot
All
of
right,
fun.
all right.
All right.
Thanks for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Sounds
Bye,
great.
Meet.
All right.